Ghost It was the night before Easter Sunday, a quiet evening that carried an eerie stillness, and I found myself standing outside an old rural church on the outskirts of town, just beyond the well-worn dirt road and miles from the nearest sign of civilization. The kind of place where the world seemed to slow down, where time itself barely seemed to exist, just the scent of freshly mown grass in the air and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. The church had always been there, at least in my memory, a humble structure with tall stained glass windows that caught the last rays of the dying sun, their colors flashing in the twilight. The stone walls of the building seemed to hold centuries of history, stories from generations of worshippers long past. And tonight, as I stood on the threshold, it felt as though the very air inside was thick with the weight of those stories. The Easter Vigil was about to begin, and as I entered the dimly lit church, I felt that same sense of reverence that I had come to expect from the service. But there was something unsettling about the quietness, something in the air that felt off. The usual hum of the congregation was absent. Only a few scattered figures sat in the pews, their faces lit by the soft glow of candles as they waited for the service to start. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though when I turned, I saw only the darkened corners of the sanctuary, the flickering shadows cast by the candlelight. The priest, a tall man with a weathered face and soft, calming voice, began the service with his usual reverence, his words filling the silence of the church. But as he spoke, I couldn't help but notice the whispers, faint but persistent, growing louder with every passing minute. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a trick of the mind caused by the darkness, or perhaps the faint echoes of my own thoughts. But the whispers seemed to grow, faint, distant murmurs that I couldn't place. It was as though they were coming from somewhere deep inside the church, hidden behind the walls, or perhaps from beneath the floorboards. I tried to ignore them, focusing on the priest's calming voice as he continued, but the whispers refused to die down. In fact, they seemed to intensify, like the murmurs of a crowd that had gathered just out of sight. I found myself glancing nervously at the other members of the congregation, wondering if they too could hear what I was hearing. But everyone remained motionless, their faces hidden in the soft glow of the candles, oblivious to the unsettling presence that had begun to fill the room. The priest's voice grew more distant, muffled as if something were blocking the sound, and the whispers grew louder. "Leave," a voice hissed, its words indistinct but unmistakable. It was like a soft breeze, a draft that seemed to pass through the church. And though I tried to remain focused on the service, the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. I turned, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing there, nothing visible. But the shadows, they were different now. They seemed deeper, darker, as though something was moving in the corners of the church. I felt it in the pit of my stomach, that growing sense of dread, a feeling that something was about to happen, something I couldn't control. My eyes scanned the pews, looking for some sign that others were feeling the same way. But no one moved. No one reacted. They sat motionless, their faces fixed in reverence, and I began to wonder if I was the only one who noticed the strange atmosphere that had descended on the church. The whispers grew louder, no longer faint murmurs, but distinct voices, their tones low and insistent. "Get out," one voice commanded. I could hear the sound of shuffling feet, though no one was moving. The air grew colder, and a chill ran down my spine. My skin prickled with the sensation of unseen eyes upon me, and though the priest continued with his service, his voice drowned beneath the rising tide of whispers. The candles flickered violently, their flames casting erratic shadows across the walls. It was then that I saw it, the figure standing just beyond the last row of pews hidden in the darkness. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, an illusion created by the flickering candles, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was a person, or at least, it looked like one. The figure was tall, its form cloaked in shadows, standing, motionless at the farthest point of the church. My heart raced, my pulse quickening with each breath as the whispers continued to grow louder, as though the figure itself was urging them on. "Leave now!" The voice hissed again, and I felt a cold breeze sweep across the room, chilling me to the bone. I tried to focus, to remain calm, but the presence of the figure was suffocating. I could feel its gaze upon me, though its face was hidden in the darkness. The candles sputtered, and for a brief moment the figure was illuminated, a fleeting glimpse that sent a jolt of fear through me. It wasn't human, I realized. It couldn't be. Its body was too tall, too elongated, and its movements, though barely perceptible, were unnatural. It glided rather than walked, its form slipping through the shadows as though it was part of them. The air grew heavy, the weight of its presence pressing in on me from all sides. My breath hitched in my throat, and I felt an overwhelming urge to run, but my feet refused to move. I was frozen, trapped by some unseen force. The priest's voice faltered, and his words became garbled as though even he could feel the presence of whatever this thing was. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure moved. It didn't walk. No, it glided, effortlessly, across the floor, its dark form sliding across the polished wooden floor as though it were weightless. It came closer, its presence growing stronger, its form more defined in the flickering candlelight. I could see its eyes now, pale, empty, and full of nothingness. And then it spoke. Not with words, but with a sound that was a mixture of a whisper and a scream, a sound that echoed in my mind and rattled my very soul. "You should not be here," it said, and in that instant I felt my body go cold as though the life was being drained from me. The figure continued to approach, its movements fluid, its presence suffocating. I tried to scream, to run, but my voice wouldn't work. My legs wouldn't move. All I could do was stand there, paralyzed, as the figure drew nearer. I could hear its breath now, a slow, deliberate exhale that sent a chill down my spine. And then, as if it were nothing more than a trick of the light, the figure vanished, slipping back into the darkness from which it had emerged. The whispering ceased immediately, the church falling into an eerie silence. I blinked, disoriented, my mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The priest's voice returned to normal, though his tone was strained, as if he, too, had been affected by what had transpired. But when I looked around, the congregation remained motionless, oblivious to the terror that had just unfolded in their midst. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that whatever had appeared in the shadows was still there, watching me, waiting. I had never left that night without a deep sense of dread, and to this day, I wonder if that figure was a warning of something darker, something far beyond my understanding. The whispers, they never stopped. They followed me home, they followed me everywhere. The silence inside the church was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the wind outside. I stood there, frozen, unable to comprehend the chilling events that had unfolded before my eyes. The figure, whatever it had been, had disappeared as quickly as it had come, leaving only the lingering scent of decay and coldness in the air. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt the sweat beginning to bead on my forehead, the heat of fear consuming me even though the room had become uncomfortably cold. I blinked several times, willing myself to believe that it had all been a figment of my imagination, a trick played by my mind in the darkness. But deep down I knew that what I had seen wasn't something that could easily be explained away. The figure hadn't just been a shadow. It hadn't been some fleeting image conjured by the flickering candlelight. It had been real, too real. I turned toward the priest, searching his face for any sign that he had seen the same thing, that he had felt the same terror, but his face was impassive, his expression unchanged. He continued with the service as if nothing had happened, his voice soft and soothing, a contrast to the chaos inside my mind. I wanted to scream at him, to demand that he acknowledge what had just occurred, but the words caught in my throat. I couldn't bring myself to break the fragile silence that had settled over the room. Instead, I remained silent, my gaze flicking nervously toward the back of the church, toward the darkness that seemed to have come alive. The congregation sat still, unmoving, their faces hidden in the soft glow of the candles. But I couldn't shake the feeling that they too were aware of something lurking in the shadows, something that they were either too afraid to acknowledge or too unwilling to confront. The whispers returned, but this time they were different. They were louder, more insistent, like a chorus of voices all speaking at once, their words indistinct but full of malice. I could feel their presence, their invisible hands reaching out, crawling beneath my skin, and I was sure they were coming from the figure. Somehow it had not left. I could hear it now moving in the darkness, its form sliding between the pews like a snake, a predator stalking its prey. The flickering of the candles intensified, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls, and that I saw it, the figure standing just beyond the last row of pews hidden in the darkness. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, an illusion created by the flickering candles, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was a person, or at least, it looked like one. The figure was tall, its form cloaked in shadows, standing motionless at the farthest point of the church. My heart raced, my pulse quickening with each breath as the whispers continued to grow louder, as though the figure itself was urging them. "On! Leave now!" the voice hissed again, and I felt a cold breeze sweep across the room, chilling me to the bone. I tried to focus, to remain calm, but the presence of the figure was suffocating. I could feel its gaze upon me, though its face was hidden in the darkness. The candles sputtered, and for a brief moment the figure was illuminated, a fleeting glimpse that sent a jolt of fear through me. It wasn't human, I realized. It couldn't be. Its body was too tall, too elongated, and its movements, though barely perceptible, were unnatural. It glided rather than walked, its form slipping through the shadows as though it was part of them. The air grew heavy, the weight of its presence pressing in on me from all sides. My breath hitched in my throat, and I felt an overwhelming urge to run, but my feet refused to move. I was frozen, trapped by some unseen force. The priest's voice faltered, and his words became garbled as though even he could feel the presence of whatever this thing was. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure moved. It didn't walk. No, it glided, effortlessly, across the floor, its dark form sliding across the polished wooden floor as though it were weightless. It came closer, its presence growing stronger, its form more defined in the flickering candlelight. I could see its eyes now, pale, empty, and full of nothingness. And then it spoke. Not with words, but with a sound that was a mixture of a whisper and a scream, a sound that echoed in my mind and rattled my very soul. "You should not be here," it said, and in that instant I felt my body go cold, as though the life was being drained from me. The figure continued to approach, its movements fluid, its presence suffocating. I tried to scream, to run, but my voice wouldn't work, my legs wouldn't move. All I could do was stand there paralyzed as the figure drew nearer. I could hear its breath now, a slow, deliberate exhale that sent a chill down my spine. And then, as if it were nothing more than a trick of the light, the figure vanished, slipping back into the darkness from which it had emerged. The whispering ceased immediately, the church falling into an eerie silence. I blinked, disoriented, my mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The priest's voice returned to normal, though his tone was strained, as if he too had been affected by what had transpired. But when I looked around, the congregation remained motionless, oblivious to the terror that had just unfolded in their midst. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that whatever had appeared in the shadows was still there, watching me, waiting. I had never left that night without a deep sense of dread, and to this day, I wonder if that figure was a warning of something darker, something far beyond my understanding. The whispers, they never stopped. They followed me home, they followed me everywhere. The silence inside the church was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the wind outside. I stood there, frozen, unable to comprehend the chilling events that had unfolded before my eyes. The figure, whatever it had been, had disappeared as quickly as it had come, leaving only the lingering scent of decay and coldness in the air. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt the sweat beginning to bead on my forehead, the heat of fear consuming me even though the room had become uncomfortably cold. I blinked several times, willing myself to believe that it had all been a figment of my imagination, a trick played by my mind in the darkness. But deep down I knew that what I had seen wasn't something that could easily be explained away. The figure hadn't just been a shadow. It hadn't been some fleeting image conjured by the flickering candlelight. It had been real, too real. I turned toward the priest, searching his face for any sign that he had seen the same thing, that he had felt the same terror. But his face was impassive, his expression unchanged. He continued with the service as if nothing had happened, his voice soft and soothing, a contrast to the chaos inside my mind. I wanted to scream at him, to demand that he acknowledge what had just occurred, but the words caught in my throat. I couldn't bring myself to break the fragile silence that had settled over the room. Instead, I remained silent, my gaze flicking nervously toward the back of the church, toward the darkness that seemed to have come alive. The congregation sat still, unmoving, their faces hidden in the soft glow of the candles. But I couldn't shake the feeling that they too were aware of something lurking in the shadows, something that they were either too afraid to acknowledge or too unwilling to confront. The whispers returned, but this time they were different. They were louder, more insistent, like a chorus of voices all speaking at once, their words indistinct but full of malice. I could feel their presence, their invisible hands reaching out, crawling beneath my skin, and I was sure they were coming from the figure. Somehow, it had not left. I could hear it now, moving in the darkness, its form sliding between the pews like a snake, a predator stalking its prey. The flickering of the candles intensified, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. The whispers grew into something more, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the air, shaking the very foundations of the church. I wanted to run, to flee from the nightmare that had ensnared me, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of lead, my body paralyzed by fear. I turned to look back at the priest, but he didn't seem to notice. His voice grew more distant, as though he too were losing himself in the whispers, in the presence that was now filling the room. The air grew thicker, heavier, suffocating, and the temperature dropped even further, until it felt like I was standing in the middle of an ice storm, my breath coming out in visible clouds. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, the growling stopped. The whispers fell silent, replaced by an oppressive stillness that seemed to settle over the church like a blanket. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in the silence. I took a slow, shaky breath, trying to steady myself to make sense of what was happening. My eyes scanned the church once again, the flickering candles casting erratic shadows across the floor, but the figure was gone. For a brief moment, I thought that maybe it had all been a nightmare, some strange waking hallucination brought on by the isolation of the church, the late hour, and the unsettling atmosphere. But the air still felt wrong, thick with a tension I couldn't shake. I turned toward the exit, my mind screaming at me to leave, to get out of this place before something worse happened. But my legs felt frozen, as though they were rooted to the floor. And then from the darkness I heard it again, a voice, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. "You are not welcome here." The words were not spoken, they were felt, as though they were being transmitted directly into my mind like a telepathic message. I could feel the malice behind them, the deep, seething hatred that was directed squarely at me. I didn't need to look back to know that the figure was there watching me, waiting. It was just a presence now, an unearthly force that seemed to fill every corner of the church, every crack in the stone walls. The voice echoed in my ears, a repetitive chant that seemed to grow louder and louder, drowning out everything else. "You are not welcome here. Leave now." I could feel my breath quicken, panic rising in my chest. I needed to leave. I had to leave. But my body refused to move, frozen by fear and the overpowering sense that something terrible was about to happen. And then, just as I thought I might collapse under the weight of the fear, the candles sputtered and died. Darkness filled the church, an impenetrable blackness that swallowed everything in its path. I could no longer see the priest, nor the other members of the congregation. The whispers stopped, replaced by an overwhelming silence that pressed in on me from all sides. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and uneven, but it seemed to come from far away, as though my body were detached from the world around me. The temperature plummeted, and I could see my breath in the air misting in front of me like smoke. It was then that I heard it, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from behind me. I turned sharply, my heart in my throat, but there was nothing. Nothing visible in the pitch-black darkness. The footsteps continued echoing through the church, growing louder with every passing second. They were getting closer. And then, a whisper just behind my ear. You should have left when you had the chance. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. My body was frozen, trapped in the darkness, and the presence, whatever it was, closed in around me, its cold breath brushing against my skin. I could hear its footsteps, feel the weight of its gaze on me, but I couldn't see it. It was there, just out of sight, waiting. The air seemed to vibrate with its presence, heavy and oppressive, as though the very church itself was alive, pulsing with an ancient, malevolent force. And then, in a sudden flash, the lights came back on. The candles flickered back to life, casting a soft, warm glow over the room. It changed. The priest was no longer standing at the altar. The congregation was gone, the church was empty, silent and cold. I was alone. I turned and ran, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the empty space, my heart racing in my chest. I didn't stop until I reached the door, wrenching it open and stumbling out into the night. The chill air hit my face, and for the first time that evening, I felt like I could breathe again. But even as I stood there, gasping for air, I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure, whatever it was still out there, watching, waiting. It was only when I got home that night, trembling in my bed, that I realized the truth. I had left the church, yes, but the church had never left me. The whispers followed me home. They followed me everywhere. And every night, as the clock struck 3:03 a.m., I would hear them again, soft at first, but growing louder as the minutes ticked by. And sometimes, just sometimes, I would feel it, the presence, the cold touch of something not quite human, standing just behind me, watching. It was Easter Sunday, and for the first time in a long time, I had decided to visit my grandmother's house for the holiday. The old farmhouse, nestled on the outskirts of our small town, had always been a place of comfort and nostalgia for me. Growing up, Easter had always been a big deal in our family, and I had fond memories of hunting for eggs in my grandmother's sprawling garden, of sitting at the long wooden table with my cousins, and of hearing my grandmother's stories about the Easter bunny and the strange traditions that surrounded the holiday. But this Easter, something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the air around the farmhouse felt heavy, oppressive. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe it was the fact that my grandmother had recently passed away, and the house, which had once been so full of life, now seemed eerily quiet. Regardless, I shrugged it off and pushed the uneasy feeling to the back of my mind as I pulled into the gravel driveway, the tires crunching beneath the weight of the moment. My cousins were already there, of course, their laughter ringing out from inside the house as they prepared for the annual Easter egg hunt. I smiled faintly as I grabbed the basket from the passenger seat of my car, but the feeling of unease didn't subside. It lingered like a dark cloud, hovering just over my shoulder, and I found myself glancing nervously toward the woods that bordered the farm. The woods had always been a place of mystery for me as a child, a place I'd been warned never to venture into alone. I remember my grandmother telling me stories about the Easter bunny, but not the kind of stories you might hear today. Hers were always darker, tinged with something sinister, something lurking just beyond the edge of the forest. She would speak in hushed tones, warning us never to stray too far, never to wander past the old stone wall that separated the farm from the woods. "The Easter bunny doesn't like it when people trespass," she'd say, her eyes glinting with a knowing look that always sent a shiver down my spine. At the time, I thought it was just a playful tale, a part of the holiday tradition. But now, as I stood outside the farmhouse looking toward the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that her warnings hadn't been mere stories at all. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, my cousins and I gathered in the backyard, eagerly awaiting the start of the egg hunt. The air was thick with anticipation as we each clutched our baskets, ready to race through the garden and find the brightly colored eggs hidden among the flowers and shrubs. But before we could begin, I heard something that made my blood run. Cold. A soft, slow tapping sound like something or someone was knocking at the door of the house. It was an odd sound, one that didn't quite fit the festive atmosphere. At first I thought it might be a neighbor stopping by, but when I glanced at the door, no one was there. I chalked it up to my nerves and turned back to my cousins, but the knocking continued. Tap, tap, tap. My unease grew with each passing second, and I felt an overwhelming urge to check the door to see if there was something or someone on the other side. I excused myself from the group and walked toward the house, the knocking growing louder with every step I took. As I reached the porch, I paused, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Something wasn't right. The atmosphere had changed. The air had grown thick and oppressive, almost suffocating, and I could feel a chill running down my spine. The knocking continued, insistent, relentless. I opened the door cautiously, expecting to see a visitor, but to my surprise, there was no one there. The porch was empty, save for a small basket, carefully placed on the ground just inside the doorway. It was an odd thing to find, especially since no one in my family had put it there. The basket was filled with colorful Easter eggs, but unlike the plastic ones we'd been using for the hunt. These were real eggs, speckled and strangely lifelike. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at the basket, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I picked it up, my fingers trembling as I ran them over the smooth surface of one of the eggs. The sudden urge to look over my shoulder swept through me, and when I did, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, a shadow moving just beyond the trees, just at the edge of the woods. I turned quickly, but whatever it was had already disappeared. I stood there for a long moment, my mind racing. Could it have been one of my cousins playing a prank? Perhaps someone had set the basket there to startle me, to make me think something strange was going on. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that none of it made sense. My cousins were all accounted for, and there was no way any of them could have placed the basket so quietly without me hearing them. I slowly turned and entered the house, the door creaking shut behind me. The knocking had stopped, but the feeling of unease had only intensified. I walked back to the backyard, the basket still clutched in my hands, and rejoined the group, trying to push the unsettling thoughts from my mind. But my gaze kept drifting toward the woods, drawn to the darkened line of trees that loomed in the distance. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something or someone was lurking in the shadows just beyond the tree line. My cousins were already deep into the hunt, laughing and calling to each other as they searched for eggs, oblivious to the strange happenings that had just unfolded. I tried to focus on the game, but my mind kept drifting, kept returning to the basket, to the knocking, and to the feeling that something was wrong. That was when I heard it again, the soft tapping, like a faint knock on the door. But this time, it wasn't coming from the house, it was coming from the woods. I froze, my blood running cold. The sound was unmistakable, clear as day. Tap, tap, tap. It echoed through the stillness of the night, a sound that seemed to travel from the depths of the forest. I felt the hairs on my neck stand up as I turned toward the woods, my heart pounding in my chest. There at the edge of the trees, a figure stood. At first, it was nothing more than a shadow, barely discernible in the fading light. But as I focused, the figure began to take shape. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its movements were slow, deliberate, as though it were gliding rather than walking. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it, unable to look away. The figure's head was low and its face was obscured by the long, tattered hood of a cloak, but what I could make out sent a wave of nausea through me. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its hands, which hung at its sides, were thin, skeletal, like those of a corpse. It was then that I realized what it was holding. In its bony fingers, the figure clutched an Easter egg, an egg just like the ones in the basket. My heart stopped as I watched the figure raise the egg to its lips and press it against its mouth, as though tasting it, savoring it. A sickening sense of dread washed over me, and I felt an overwhelming compulsion to run, to escape the darkness that seemed to stretch out from the woods and envelop the figure. But before I could make a move, the figure suddenly turned and disappeared into the trees, as if it had never been there at all. I stood frozen for a long time, my mind racing, my heart pounding in my chest. Something was terribly wrong. The figure wasn't just a person in a cloak. It was something else, something ancient, something tied to the land itself. I could feel it in my bones, in the air around me, and as the last of the daylight faded and the shadows grew long, I knew that whatever it was, it had come for a reason. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the echo of the tapping still lingering in the air, thick with foreboding. My eyes remained locked on the spot where the figure had vanished into the woods, my entire body frozen in place. The darkness beyond the trees seemed to pulse, as if alive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something much more sinister than anything I had ever known. I felt an undeniable urge to run back inside the house, to lock the doors and pretend none of this had happened, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. There was something out there, something waiting for me. As the minutes ticked by, the tapping sound returned, only this time it was louder, closer. It came from the edge of the woods just beyond the tree line, as if whatever had been hiding there was making its way closer to the house. Pounded in my chest as I stepped back, inching toward the back door of the farmhouse, my feet unsteady beneath me. But I couldn't bring myself to move any faster. My body seemed to have betrayed me, frozen in terror as the sound grew, louder. Tap, tap, tap. It was rhythmic, methodical, like the beating of a drum, and each knock sent a shiver through my spine. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and fled, racing toward the door as if my life depended on it. I burst into the house, slamming the door behind me, and I leaned against it, gasping for breath. My cousins were still outside, lost, in their Easter egg hunt, their laughter ringing out in the distance. But to me, it all felt hollow, like a distant memory of a time that no longer existed. I wanted to shout for them to come inside, to warn them, but the words wouldn't leave my throat. I was paralyzed by fear, overwhelmed by the suffocating sense of dread that had taken hold of me. I leaned against the door, straining to hear any sound, any movement outside, but the world was eerily silent. The tapping had stopped, and for a moment I thought maybe it had all been a figment of my imagination. Maybe I had just been hearing things, seeing things that weren't there. But deep down, I knew better. The figure, the Easter egg, the knocking, all of it was too real, too vivid, and the fear that had gripped me was too consuming to ignore. I glanced around the house, the once comforting, familiar space now feeling like a prison. The walls seemed to close in on me, the shadows creeping along the edges, making everything feel claustrophobic. The house that had once been filled with laughter and warmth now felt cold and empty. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something had changed and I had no idea how to stop it. Then I heard it again, the faint tapping, this time from the window. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Slowly I turned, my legs shaking with each step as I made my way toward the window. I parted the curtains just enough to peer outside, and what I saw nearly made me collapse in terror. Standing just beyond the porch in the moonlight was the figure. Its face was still obscured, hidden beneath the tattered hood, but this time I could see its eyes. They were glowing, an unnatural, sickly green, and they stared right at me, unblinking, as if they could see into the very depths of my soul. The Easter egg it had been holding was now in its outstretched hand, and it was pointing toward the house, as if inviting me to come closer. I recoiled, my breath catching in my throat, and I backed away from the window, my mind racing with panic. What did it want? Why was it here? And most terrifying of all, what did it want with the Easter eggs? I quickly turned and ran to the kitchen, my heart racing with the need to escape, to find a way out of this nightmare. But as I reached the door to the back porch, I stopped dead in my tracks. There on the floor in front of me was another basket, just like the one from earlier, just like the one I had found outside. This time, however, the eggs inside were cracked, broken, oozing a dark, viscous liquid that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The sight of it made my stomach churn, and I quickly stepped around the basket, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the walls warping and bending, as though the house itself were being twisted by some malevolent force. The tapping had returned, now louder than ever, and it was coming from all directions, surrounding me, echoing in my mind. Tap, tap, tap. The sound grew louder and faster, and suddenly I realized the source of the noise. It wasn't coming from the woods or the window. It was coming from inside the house. Panic surged through me as I ran to the front door, but when I reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. I yanked and pulled, but the door was locked, the key nowhere to be found. I turned, searching for an escape, but the house had become a maze, its rooms shifting and distorting as if they were alive, trapping me inside. The tapping grew louder, closer, until it seemed to fill every corner of the house. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and I could hear whispers in the yi. Dark corners of the rooms, voices that seemed to call my name. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling, when I felt something cold and clammy wrap around my ankle. I screamed, but the sound was muffled, as though my voice were being swallowed by the very walls of the house. I looked down to see a hand, a thin, skeletal hand, emerging from beneath the floorboards, its bony fingers curling around my leg, pulling me toward the ground. I kicked and screamed, trying to break free, but the hand was too strong, too persistent. It dragged me inch by inch toward the center of the room. I clawed at the floor, my nails scraping against the wood, but it was no use. The hand kept pulling, and soon I was on my knees, struggling to stay upright. I could feel the floorboards shifting beneath me, the house groaning and creaking as if it were alive. It wasn't just the Easter Bunny anymore. It was something much older, much more dangerous. The tapping reached a crescendo, and suddenly everything went silent. The hand released me, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. I looked around, terrified, expecting to see the figure standing over me, but the room was empty. The silence was deafening, and for a moment, I thought I might have imagined it all. But as I looked at the basket, at the broken eggs, I knew it hadn't been a dream. Something dark was stirring in the house, and whatever it wasn't done with me yet. It all started like a normal Easter Sunday, the kind of day that would have felt peaceful, joyful, and full of laughter, if it weren't for the dread that lingered beneath the surface. I had been invited to a family reunion in a small town on the outskirts of the city, somewhere I had never been before. The house itself was an old, sprawling farmhouse, surrounded by fields and dense woods, tucked away from the bustling life of the city. My aunt had always hosted these gatherings, and though I hadn't been to one in years, the invitation felt like the perfect opportunity to reconnect with my relatives. My cousins were already there when I arrived, laughing, chatting, and sharing stories as we settled in. The food was abundant, the house filled with the smell of ham, roast potatoes, and pies. It felt like a typical family Easter celebration, the kind I'd experienced countless times in my childhood. As the day wore on, my aunt encouraged us to go on a walk around the property, to stretch our legs and enjoy the beauty of the land. My cousins and I, eager to escape the crowded house for a while, set off toward the woods at the edge of the property. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the fields, and the air was crisp with the promise of spring. We laughed and joked as we walked, the woods growing denser as we made our way deeper into the trees. The path was familiar to my cousins, who had visited this house many times before, but I found myself feeling increasingly uneasy. There was something about the woods, something dark, like an oppressive weight hanging in the air. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. After all, it was getting late, and the shadows of the trees were beginning to distort the world around us. But as we walked further, the unease only grew. The sound of birds had stopped, and there was an eerie silence that hung over the woods, as if nature itself had held its breath. My cousins seemed oblivious, chatting away about some silly joke or another, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Something was out there, lurking in the trees, waiting for the right moment to make its move. I tried to push the feeling aside, but every step I took seemed to amplify it, like the very earth beneath my feet was trying to tell me to turn back. But I didn't. We continued deeper into the woods, our path winding around ancient trees and over moss-covered rocks, until we finally came to a clearing. At the center of the clearing stood an old weathered stone well, the kind you'd see in a fairy tale, the kind of place where things should be left alone. It looked abandoned, its stone walls cracked and crumbling, the opening dark and foreboding. For a moment I thought we should leave, but my cousins were already approaching the well, intrigued by its presence. "So I bet there's treasure down there," one of them said, peering into the dark opening. "Or maybe a monster," another added, half laughing. I felt a shiver run down my spine. The well wasn't just an ordinary structure. It felt wrong. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of foreboding that made my heart race. As I stood there staring at the well, I felt an overwhelming urge to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But before I could move, one of my cousins, Jason, the oldest of the group, crouched down to get a better look inside. "It's too dark to see anything," he said, standing up. "I'll throw a rock in, see how deep it goes." I watched him take a large stone from the ground and drop it into the well, the sound of it echoing into the abyss. The seconds stretched into minutes as we waited for the splash, but it never came. The stone simply vanished into the darkness. "That's strange," Jason muttered, standing up and brushing off his pants. "I could have sworn that was a pretty deep well. It should have made a sound." My heart was racing. I wanted to scream, to tell them to leave, but the words wouldn't come. There was something deeply unsettling about this place, something ancient and unnatural, and I didn't want to be anywhere near it. "Back," I suggested, my voice barely above a whisper. "This place gives me the creeps." But before anyone could respond, a loud noise shattered the silence. A screeching, grating sound like nails on a chalkboard filled the air, sending a chill down my spine. We all turned toward the direction of the sound, but there was nothing there, nothing except the dense trees and the growing darkness. "What was that?" my cousin Emily asked, her voice trembling with fear. "I don't know," Jason said, his tone suddenly serious, "but we should leave, now." He turned to face the path we had come from, but as he did, his face went pale. I followed his gaze, my stomach dropping as I saw what he saw. Standing at the edge of the clearing just beyond the trees was a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, and it wore a tattered, dark cloak that seemed to shimmer in the fading light. Its face was obscured, hidden beneath a hood, but even from this distance I could feel its gaze, cold, empty, unforgiving. The figure didn't move at first, simply standing there, watching us. Then with a slow, deliberate motion it raised a hand that was skeletal, its skin stretched tight over bone, its fingers long and bony, each one tipped with sharp yellow claws. I gasped, my mind racing with terror. What was that thing? Why was it here? But before I could process it, the figure turned and disappeared into the trees, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. For a long moment, no one moved. We stood frozen in the clearing, the tension thick and heavy in the air. Then, without warning, my cousin Jason turned and ran. "We need to get back to the house," he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. We followed him, running blindly through the woods, our feet stumbling over rocks and branches, our breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The sound of footsteps behind us, heavy and deliberate, echoed in the silence. Someone or something was chasing us. We ran through the dense woods, each of us driven by a primal fear, our hearts pounding in our chests as if they were about to explode. The sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoed behind us, but when we glanced over our shoulders, there was nothing there. It was as though the trees themselves were swallowing the sound, hiding whatever lurked just beyond the line of sight. We had to get back to the house. The farmhouse, with its warm light spilling from the windows, had never seemed so distant, so out of reach. The woods seemed endless, a labyrinth of gnarled trees and thick underbrush that slowed our progress with every step. My breath came in ragged gasps, my legs felt like lead, and yet I couldn't stop. None of us could. As we pushed through the thick foliage, I noticed that the sounds of the forest had changed. The birds that had once chirped in the trees were now silent. The wind, which had rustled the leaves so gently earlier, had stilled. There was a heavy, oppressive silence, broken only by the frantic pounding of our feet on the forest floor. I stumbled over a branch and nearly fell, my heart racing as panic surged through me. I glanced around, searching for the others, but they were too far ahead. Jason, our leader and the one who had initially urged us to turn back, was now in the lead, his breath ragged but steady. Behind him, Emily, the youngest of the group, was struggling to keep up, her face pale with fear. "Come on!" Jason shouted, over his shoulder, his voice cutting through the eerie silence. "We're almost there, just keep running." I wanted to scream at them to stop, to turn and face whatever was chasing us, but the terror that gripped my chest was too strong. My body moved on its own, pushing forward as if it had a mind of its own. The woods had become an endless blur of trees and shadows. Every corner we turned seemed to lead to another, and no matter how fast we ran, the farmhouse seemed just as far away as it had been when we first set foot in the woods. And then, suddenly, I saw it. In the distance, through the trees, the soft light from the farmhouse windows illuminated the space ahead. We were almost there. A glimmer of hope flared in my chest. We could make it. But as soon as the thought crossed my mind, something changed. The air grew colder, a chill creeping through, the woods that cut through my clothes and into my skin. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a sense of dread washed over me, suffocating in its intensity. I turned my head again, searching for the sound of footsteps behind us, but I saw nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us, something just out of sight, watching, waiting. Emily's voice broke through the tension. I don't think we're alone," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. I didn't need to ask what she meant. I could feel it too. The forest was no longer just a collection of trees. It had become something else, something alive, something that was aware of our presence. A rustling sound from the woods to the left made my heart skip a beat, and my eyes darted in that direction. The shadows between the trees seemed to move, as though they were alive, shifting and undulating with an unnatural rhythm. I could barely make out the figure through the branches, but it was there, standing at the edge of the woods, watching us with its eerie, hooded gaze. I stumbled and nearly fell, my breath coming in panicked gasps as I tried to push forward. But the figure remained where it was, still as stone, waiting. Then, in the blink of an eye, it moved. It didn't run, didn't lunge toward us. Instead, it moved with a slow, deliberate pace, gliding between the trees like a shadow in the night. It was as if the forest itself was helping it, parting the trees and branches to create a clear path for it to follow. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. We weren't just being chased, we were being hunted. Jason must have sensed it too, because he glanced over his shoulder, his eyes locking on the figure in the woods. His face went pale, and for a moment it seemed like he had forgotten how to breathe. "Run!" he shouted again, his voice desperate, but it was almost as though the words came too late. The creature had already closed the distance between us. "Run!" My legs moved faster, faster than I thought possible, but the creature, whatever it was closing in. Every step I took felt heavier, like I was running through water, my body refusing to obey my mind. The figure, now closer than ever, moved with terrifying speed, its long skeletal limbs stretching unnaturally as it reached toward us. It was still cloaked in darkness, its face hidden beneath the hood, but the smell that emanated from it, decay, rot, death, was unmistakable. It wasn't a man, it wasn't even human. It was something far worse. And then, as if in slow motion, I saw its hand stretch out and grab Emily by the arm. The sound of her scream pierced the silence of the woods, a scream that seemed to echo in my skull. She kicked and struggled, but the creature's grip was unyielding. Her cries were swallowed by the forest, and before I could reach her, she was gone, pulled into the shadows, disappearing like smoke. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart clenching in my chest. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't think. Emily was gone, just like that. I felt a coldness creeping up my spine as I tried to process what had just happened. Jason was the first to react, his voice hoarse as he shouted for Emily, but it was too late. The creature had vanished as quickly as it had appeared, taking her with it into the darkness. "What the hell was that?" Jason screamed, his voice full of panic. But I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was reeling, too shocked by the horror that had just unfolded. Emily was gone, vanished, just like that. "We need to go back," I whispered, my voice trembling. "We need to get to the house, now." Jason nodded, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. We didn't stop. We didn't even look back as we ran through the woods, our only goal to reach the house, to get out of this nightmare before it claimed more of us. But as we ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still there, following us, watching us. And deep down I knew one thing for sure: we hadn't seen the last of it.